Hello class, this is Foundations of Instructional Delivery, Fire and Emergency Services Instructor 1, Chapter 5, Using Lesson Plans. The objectives we're going to cover in this class are as follows. We will identify and describe the components of learning objectives, describe the parts of a lesson plan, describe the instructional preparation process, describe the lesson plan, adaptation process, and limits for Fire and Emergency Services Instructor 1, and identify the factors to consider when scheduling a training session. When most people think about the job of Fire and Emergency Services Instructor, they picture an actual delivery of a presentation in front of the classroom. While lectures are an important part and aspect of instruction, it's not the only part of the job. Most instructors spend many hours planning and preparing for a class before students ever arrive in the classroom. This is when you learn to appreciate the role of teachers, because teachers spend summers going to symposiums and drawing up lesson plans for an entire calendar year and things like that. They have to grade homework every day. They have work to do before class starts. As an instructor, you have many of those same responsibilities. During planning and preparation, think about the following. What are the expected outcomes or objectives of the training session? How much time will the class take? How many students are going to attend a particular class? Are there student prerequisites that are required to understand the objectives? And making sure that everyone has completed proper prerequisites if they are. Also, which training aids and equipment will be needed? In what order will the instructional material be presented? And will the delivery schedule be affected by availability of specific resources? The information you need to complete a class or complete teaching a class is compiled into a document called a lesson plan. It's a detailed guide that's used to prepare and deliver instruction to students. A well-prepared and thorough lesson plan greatly increases the quality of student learning. Just winging it is downright dangerous at the lowest end, completely irresponsible in the middle, and at the high end, maybe you get away with it, but you're probably going to leave something out. So use your lesson plans. Instructor 1 uses a lesson plan that's already developed, while Instructor 2 receives training in how to develop their own lesson plan and then may be ultimately responsible for developing all parts. So the practice you get from using all aspects of your lesson plan, reading it and using it, will help you when you become Instructor 2 to develop your own lesson plans in the future. Instructor 1 is able to adapt a plan to meet specific student-centered needs, and we've talked a lot about this in chapters 1 through 4, but you cannot modify content. Already understand the learning process, because we've talked about that, and you understand various methods of instruction and communication skills, and we've already talked about all of those. That knowledge allows use of the plan as a tool to influence a change in behavior. Why use a lesson plan? Working from a prepared lesson plan is a process that many firefighters have no experience with. If you've never taught before, then you're probably not familiar with it. And you may have participated as a student many times, but when you're on the other side of the lectern, that is a different story. So your experience as an instructor is not going to necessarily help you. I mean, being a student for a long time will help you to some degree, but it's not going to help you to an advanced degree to do some of the mechanics like using a lesson plan. Many new instructors without experience in the field of education may not understand the importance of a lesson plan. And I mentioned this briefly a moment ago. Attempting to deliver instruction without a lesson plan is like driving in a foreign country without a map. And that's also true. You just can't wing it, especially with something as important as fire science. It's just far too dangerous. Without that map or lesson plan, most instructors or new instructors likely will not reach the destination. In other words, they will not have completed the learning objectives because you may have skipped content, you may have skipped safety points that are important, and you're going to have inconsistency in delivery. So without clearly written learning objectives and a plan, your lesson plan for how to achieve them, there's a pretty good probability that you will not be successful ultimately. Occasionally, an instructor may use a lesson plan from an established or ongoing training program. Sure, that's perfectly acceptable. If it's one that functions well, that's clear, meets all of your objectives and qualifications to use, then yeah, why reinvent the wheel if you don't have to? Now, these plans are adapted for previous deliveries based on a specific audience and factors related to that class. So you may have to do a little bit of modification, but failure to check an existing lesson plan fully against your own class requirement, which I just mentioned, may result in inferior lesson delivery for students. Written lesson plans ensure the consistency of training throughout the department, especially if a class is taught multiple times by different instructors. And if there's one thing that is so critical in fire training, it is consistency. Consistency, consistency, consistency. Because depending on the schedules, you're always part of a team, but you may have different team members one week than you do the next week. And it's important that you all start out on the same foot. Otherwise, if you try to march and some of you are marching starting on the right and some of you start marching with the left foot, you're going to wind up running right into each other. So it is really important that that consistency is in place. Lesson plans are also used to document what was taught. When the class needs to be taught again in the future, the new instructor will be able to refer to existing plans, if they exist, and achieve the same learning objectives. So as an instructor too, if you write a set of lesson plans and you've got a different instructor teaching the class the next time, offer up your lesson plans. Why not? It'll save them agony and provide consistency. Now, that's provided that you wrote really good lesson plans. So it's a good idea if you're going to hand them off to, and they're ones that you prepared yourself, as an instructor too, then sit down and review them with your incoming instructor. Let's talk about understanding learning objectives. All instructional planning begins by identifying the desired outcomes. What is it that we're trying to achieve here? These desired outcomes are called learning objectives. A goal achieved through an attainment of a skill, knowledge, or both that can be observed or measured is a learning objective. They're also called sometimes performance outcomes or behavioral outcomes. Usually, at least that's been my experience in fire training, they're almost always called learning objectives. Effective instructors always start presentations by discussing and reviewing objectives. And if you notice, in every chapter we've had a brief introduction as far as points we're going to cover, and then we've had a summary at the end to remind you all the things that were covered. It should always be that way in your class too. Start your presentation by discussing and reviewing objectives. Class, this is what we're going to learn today about X. A terminal objective is a broader outcome that requires a specific set of skills or knowledge after a learning process. Enabling objective or an intermediate objective is usually part of a series that directs the instructor on what to instruct and what learners will learn to accomplish the terminal objective. The terminal objective is just a fancy way of saying the ultimate outcome. Terminal and enabling objectives are developed from JPRs, and JPRs are covered at the Instructor 2 level. But this is in your book, so please read it. As far as components of learning objectives, there are many different methods that may be used for writing learning objectives. The ABCD method is generally the most common. It's an acronym, stands for audience, behavior, condition, and degree. But learning objectives don't have to be written in that specific order. It's just an easy way for you to remember all the things you need to consider. The audience describes the students, and it's acceptable to reference the audience once at the beginning of your objectives list, as long as all relate to that same specific audience. If an objective is written correctly, audience demographics will be evident. B is behavior, and this must be an observable and measurable action where you state, describe, and identify. This is material you're going to present. You may identify a type of presentation or class where you describe a state equals knowledge, which is cognitive objective, and demonstrate and perform, which is an action, and that's a psychomotor objective. Blend your presentation styles to enhance the learning environment whenever possible. Appealing to multiple senses and allowing for many application opportunities enhances learning. C is condition. It describes the situation in which the student will perform the behavior, and it includes the following: specific equipment or resource, PPE or safety items, physical location or circumstances, etc. D is degree, which indicates how well the student is expected to perform the behavior in the listed conditions. Total mastery of a skill would require 100% completion rate or perfection. Psychomotor objectives often require 100% completion, and you can appreciate why in the fire service that is so. Cognitive objectives are expected to be learned to the degree of passing a written exam, 70 to 80%. Remember, that's general. There are many fire service classes that 80% is the lowest grade you can get to pass. Time limit is also frequently used. Now, we've just discussed ABCD method. Let's talk now about using it. Well-written learning objectives should contain all the four elements of the ABCD method. The objectives are often shortened because one or more elements are assumed to be known. When you start out as a Fire Instructor 1 and you see that list of objectives, pay attention to that, not only to see what you're going to be covering, but as you move from one class to another, teaching different classes, reviewing those objectives carefully will help you when you become Fire Instructor 2 and you have to write them out for yourself. It helps you identify and write a clear, brief objective, makes you aware of covering all of the objectives when you go to list them, and also it will help you with the writing style that they should be written in. Audience or condition previously have been stated. Many are written with the understanding that the degree will be determined by testing, and are shortened only when assumptions for missing components are clearly stated elsewhere. Using ABCD method means that you're unlikely to omit a behavior component. Some curricula do require ABCD to be stated each time in sequence and in complete form. So you need to make sure that you read your curricula guidelines and that your lesson plan follows those as required, and also later when you're writing your own, it really becomes important to make sure that you're completing them according to your curricula. Not all the parts of your lesson plan need to be in the ABCD order. We already mentioned that. Inclusion of all these 4 elements is essential in construction of the terminal objective or your ultimate objective. Subsequent enabling objectives may assume certain points that are previously stated in the main objective. Now let's talk about parts of a lesson plan. There are many different styles and formats for lesson plans that exist, but there are certain components that should always be included, no matter the style and format. Each of the following components is necessary for you to understand and follow a lesson plan. So let's talk about those now. First, you have lesson title. This describes what a lesson plan is about. You should be able to determine just by the title whether a plan contains information about the desired topic. The title page may be used to highlight or preview content of the lesson plan package. It may serve as a summary of all the contents and help prepare for a class. This is an example of a title page, and it's a good one. It's got an instructor, time allotted, topic, teaching method. That may be optional depending on where you're going, but I would encourage you to use it until you achieve a really high mastery level. But basically, just always use it. You can write down handouts, etc. This is a really good lesson title. Now let's discuss level of instruction. Students must be able to understand instructional material. Ensure that your lesson plan is written at the appropriate level for students. Often, the lesson plan corresponds with NFPA standards and also the level of the students. So new recruits or cadets equal firefighter 1 or 2 level of instruction. Professional development means fire officer 1 or 2 level of instruction. You can label with descriptors like beginner, intermediate, or advanced. That's a little less confusing for a lot of people. And the levels of instruction include identification of prerequisites, which can often be another class. Sometimes it's also a certification or rank, or it might be both. Some classes you aren't qualified to take until you become an officer, for instance. I know that's true in the military. So, but it's true also in fire training and in a lot of other fields. So make sure that you're aware of prerequisites for you to instruct. Now there's a method of delivery. This is an important element in the lesson plan. At a glance, you can see whether a class is a classroom lecture or hands-on training. Some agencies who review training delivery will measure the number of hands-on sessions versus classroom sessions to make sure that there's a good balance. Some examples of methods of instruction include lecture, demonstration, and small group instruction. Learning objectives are essential to the lesson plan, and they include behavioral objectives, performance objectives, and learning outcomes. All lesson plans must have learning objectives. There are many methods for determining and listing objectives, but the method is not as important as ensuring that you understand the objectives, and that later when you're writing your own lesson plans that you include all the objectives you want to achieve so that you can go back and reference your lesson plan, or if you're given a pre-written lesson plan, look at the objectives, then go back and make sure they're all covered in your lesson plan. Instructor 2 uses job performance requirements to develop objectives in ABCD. And Instructor 3 writes the course objectives. In regard to references, Instructors who are not experts in a subject may need to refer to additional references or resources to obtain further information. Names of books, websites, and names of experts. Now, if you're using websites, make sure that it is a qualified research or informational website. There's a lot of issue with students wanting to use Wikipedia for research papers, and that is not acceptable because Wikipedia is an open source platform that can be edited by anybody. So make sure that when, as far as being an instructor, if you're going to use a website, make sure it is not an open source platform and that it is material that comes from an accredited or qualified published person or establishment. And also using names of experts. If you notice names in your text or in your lesson plan and you want to find out more information and see if maybe there's something from a specific expert that you want to include along with your lesson plan, then certainly you can reference these experts. By citing references in the lesson plan, the validity of the lesson plan can be verified. Just like you cite sources in a research paper, citing your references in your lesson plan is equally as important for the reasons that I was just talking about, like for instance using Wikipedia. Generally, it's correct, but generally. Materials needed. Most lesson plans require some type of instructional materials to be used in the delivery of the lesson plan. This is designed to help you present that lesson plan to your students effectively. And it can include computer, handouts, pictures, diagrams, models, and additional supplies like paper, pencils, and rulers. Some of this actual equipment can be shown and passed around during class time. So, for example, if you have I don't know, something small that you happen to have on hand because you want to hold it up and visually show the class, if it's small enough to pass around, pass it around. Some lesson plans indicate approximate delivery time. In other words, they'll say it takes 5 minutes to cover X and 12 minutes to cover Y, but it's a subjective estimate because there are many factors that influence the amount of time actually used in the real world, and sometimes that includes the amount of discussion. The lesson outline is the main body of the lesson plan. There's a 4-step method of instruction, which is preparation, presentation, application, and evaluation. Each area fulfills a specific purpose in the delivery of instruction, and that's each area of your lesson outline or the main body. Instructors who engage students effectively use each part to ensure that your objectives are properly met. The lesson summary summarizes the lesson plan, reviews and reinforces main points, and allows instructors to enhance the application step by asking summary questions on key objective and lesson points. Assignment is usually a homework type exercise, and this allows the student to further explore or apply material presented. Be prepared to explain the following: the assignment, its due date, the method for submission, and grading criteria. Now, instructional preparation. Once you have a lesson plan, the instructional preparation begins. And you need to ask yourself a few things. Which materials are needed for the class? What instructional technology will I need? What are those tools? Where will the class be conducted? how much time will be needed, and the information contained in the lesson plan should be used as a guide for instructional preparation. So if it says on your title page or on your title that it takes 4 hours to complete this training, well, that's if you started and stopped with no breaks. So you have to factor in breaks, you have to factor in where you're likely to get questions or a lot of questions. You have to factor in, all of those types of elements. So give yourself always extra time. Now, in regards to student preparation, students should be prepared and ready to learn. Rules may prohibit cell phones or reading materials, and we talked about this in an earlier chapter. If someone's on call, then their phone needs to be set on vibrate. But as a rule, fire classes do not allow cell phones to be on. Instructors should monitor student preparedness. So if you notice that people come to class with no textbooks, maybe something happened. But you need to be aware. Do they have their materials? Do they have pens? Do they have everything they need, etc.? You can enhance this readiness for the students by providing information and objectives ahead of time. As a rule, in fire instruction fire training, all these materials are disseminated well before class. And as a rule, everyone comes to class prepared, ready to learn. Outcomes may improve if students take time to prepare before class. And like I said, if you hand it out early enough, as early as you can, then they tend to come to class all squared away. Bringing textbooks, notebooks, and writing supplies are an important part of preparation. And in the digital age, invariably, people don't have pens. So have extra pens, highlighters, things like that available for your students, because invariably someone's going to need one. Let's discuss organizational techniques. You need to identify the time available to plan and prepare for a class. Usually the amount of time from the point where the lesson plan is identified until the day when the class is scheduled is your window for organization. You need to identify milestones that must be accomplished as part of this timeline. That includes obtaining audiovisual equipment, purchasing materials, reserving a classroom, and previewing instructional aids, and several other things that aren't included on this brief list. Procuring instructional materials and equipment. Most classes take advantage of instructional materials or equipment. The method of obtaining these differs from department to department and can, if you're holding a class, depending on where you're holding a class, the method for acquiring materials can and will vary from venue to venue. So commonly, the instructor must contact the person responsible for purchasing, such as a training officer, if you need to purchase materials for a class, if you need to make sure that you have an overhead projector, television, whatever it is you need. You also will have a point of contact if you're using an off-site venue. You may be required to provide a list of needed materials, and this is often, but as a rule should be, submitted well in advance of the day your class begins. And that can depend in part on your purchasing requirements of a specific agency. The training officer compiles materials either by purchasing or by securing materials already available. But it's your job to follow up and make sure that all of that is ultimately done. The training officer contacts the instructor when all class-related materials are available. If they say they're going to get everything squared away, everything that you need by, for example, the 20th of the month, don't wait and call them on the 19th if you haven't heard from them. It's a good idea to call after a reasonable amount of time and ask, is everything proceeding normally in terms of what I need for a specific class? That's when you find out that perhaps your textbooks are on back order, so you aren't going to be able to teach your class on the original date, etc. So you don't want to hound the person in charge of procuring things, but you do want to, in advance of the class and after a reasonable time that you submitted your request, check in and make sure that the process is moving as smoothly as it should. Another common method is the checkout process. This is typically managed by the training division. You might be required to pick up and set up specific equipment, but regardless of how you obtain the equipment, make sure you know how to use it and troubleshoot any issues before the class is taught. Preparing to instruct is the most important part of preparation. If you obtain needed materials but do not prepare the actual lesson, the class will just not be successful. Be thoroughly familiar with all contents of the plan, because it may require you to consult the references listed. You should always rehearse your presentation before delivery as well. Your class is destined for failure if you're seeing the presentation material for the first time in front of the students, and they're going to know it. Successful instructors have a sound understanding of information that they're delivering and can adapt that material to particular needs of a given class. Scheduling. Define and understand the goal of a training session. Determine the time necessary to deliver that training session or class and the department scheduling process. Identify and locate all materials for this class and prepare requests for resources through proper channels, and ensure that expendable materials are replaced and accounted for in the agency. Sometimes scheduling will require that you gain approval from supervisors for members to attend the session. Make sure to schedule and deliver classes according to the AHJ. Make sure notice is given to any instructors who will assist. You must complete the training record reports as required by department policy. Once complete, forward all reports through the proper channels for record-keeping purposes. We're going to talk now about adapting versus creating a lesson plan. Lesson plans are rarely implemented exactly as written. Review JPRs for NFPA Standard 1041 about creating and adapting a lesson plan. Definitely do it, because NFPA have things so squared away. For Fire and Emergency Services Instructor 1, review instructional materials so the elements that are needed or that need adaptation are identified. Adapt a prepared plan so the needs of the students and the objectives of the plan are achieved. Do not alter content or lesson objectives, however. Those things cannot change. For Instructor 1, prior to beginning a class, the instructor should evaluate local conditions, assess your facility for appropriateness, meet local standard operating procedures, SOPs, and identify any potential limitations, any students' limitations, so that you can adapt. You should be able to change the method of instruction and course materials to meet student needs and accommodate individual learner characteristics. For Instructor 2, you need to create a lesson plan so that learning objectives, lesson outline, course materials, instructional technology tools, an evaluation plan, and learning objectives for the topic are addressed. You can make basic or fundamental changes as Instructor 2, where you perhaps change performance objectives, rewrite learning outcome, or modify the content of the lesson. As with all other positions, it is important that instructors perform only the actions within their scope of training. So I've been hammering on about don't change the content. Well, as Instructor 1, absolutely not. And really, as Instructor 2, you shouldn't. However, if you receive a lesson plan that someone else used for that same class, while you're sitting there discussing it or reviewing it with them, you may notice that you want to spend a little extra time on whatever topic. So when they say modifying content, if it's one that was written by another instructor, you need to absolutely read it. But as far as adjusting content, you need to make sure that you're still meeting all of the mandatory coverage for the class. But if you want to add a little bit or make any changes like that, that's fine. And that goes hand in hand with this next point. Recognize what you can and cannot do, because acting outside of the scope of training can lead to legal liability. Absolutely. If you're not sure, you need to go to your superior officer and ask, hey, is it okay for me to do whatever? Because there may be some ambiguity. If you're going through the SOPs and you're not sure whether or not you can cover something or make a particular change, to ease any doubt and to make sure that you are protected and staying within the scope of your training, discuss it with a superior, the appropriate superior. Lesson plans must remain dynamic in both the short term and the long term. And what does that mean? Short term, understand when it is appropriate to adjust a lesson plan during its delivery based on students' learning styles, changing conditions, timing considerations, and students' progress. Long term means that you're providing input to a supervisor regarding success of the delivery of a class. One critical component of adaptability is break times. You may need to adjust to reflect your training environment or to accommodate other classes. If you're teaching a class and you've got 8 students in it, and the next time you teach it, you've got 25, you're going to have to allow a little bit different amount of time for breaks or schedule them slightly more often, etc. If you make adjustments, it is critical, however, to ensure that all objectives are still covered and in a timely fashion. The program coordinator should be advised if an instructor intends to move portions around, so the coordinator can ensure that those changes do not affect other programs and shared resources. Reviewing instructional materials for adaptation. There are many ways for Instructor 1 to obtain a lesson plan. You have fire service websites, commercially published curriculum packages, NFPA, fire department's training library, and other fire departments. Regardless of the origin, the lesson plan must be reviewed. Any areas that need adaptation must be identified. This is true for plans originally developed within your own department. Over time, standards and procedures change, and a plan that was completely correct when it was created may be out of date in just a few months. Things happen quickly, so reviewing the lesson plan is really important, not only for the sake of preparation, etc., but also if there have been policy changes, or for instance, if a law has gone into effect, things like that. That's critical, because your lesson plan, otherwise you're teaching obsolete material or incorrect material. As part of the class planning and preparation process, adaptations must be scheduled and completed before the class presentation. Always be prepared to adapt your plan to accommodate last-minute classroom or equipment changes. If you're teaching from a prepared lesson plan within your department only, most factors are likely already known, so you may have to adapt the plan only if it's from an outside source, or you need to tailor it to your available allotted delivery time, or the amount of time you've been given to teach the class. It is important to evaluate local conditions. Let's talk about this topic. Your main focus should be on minor adjustments to fit local conditions and student needs, and a few other things that we've discussed. But ask the following questions to yourself about your class. Which organizational policies and procedures apply to the lesson plan? What is the current level of knowledge and ability of the students that I'm going to be having? Which types of tools and equipment will your students use in performing the skills within the lesson plan? Ask the following questions about local conditions. What is your experience level and ability? Can you identify resources and materials to improve your knowledge and background? How familiar are you as an instructor with the topic that will be taught? And this next point, which I've hammered pretty hard in previous chapters, if you are not familiar with the topic, do not fake it. First of all, it's dangerous. It's also irresponsible. And any respect your students have for you will disappear. And also, what is your teaching style? The answers to these will allow you to adapt the lesson plan to deliver it in the most effective way, given your own abilities. Evaluating a facility for appropriateness. Review and adapt the lesson plan based on the facilities that will be used, and consider the following: equipment availability, student seating, classroom size, lighting, and environmental noise. What's not on this list but also needs to be considered is temperature. If you are teaching for your department in a facility you're very familiar with, and you know, for instance, that the air conditioning doesn't work well in one classroom but it works fine in the other, consider using the one where it works well. Some things you can't anticipate, but if you're already familiar, that one you should include also. Meeting local SOPs. One of the most important considerations when you're adapting a lesson plan is meeting your SOPs. And never teach information that contradicts an SOP. It is not only confusing for the students, but you put yourself in sometimes what could be a serious liability situation. Make notes of SOPs that cover topics in the plan. After completely reviewing, search SOPs for conflicts. So if you review through your lesson plan and what you need to complete the training, you need to know if that's going to contradict or conflict with standing SOPs. Adapt a lesson plan to meet local SOPs as long as it doesn't change the objectives. Make sure to contact someone within the department if assistance is needed. Evaluating limitations of students. Adapt the lesson plan to accommodate student limitations if possible for the appropriate educational level, and also be sure to verify prerequisite knowledge and skills. Adapting the method of instruction. This is one area the Instructor 1 may readily modify, and we've mentioned this a few times, but let's look at it with a more focused lens on this specific subject of adapting the method of instruction. It should not change the learning objectives, first and foremost. Allowing the same information to be taught in a different format allows the same learning objectives to be achieved. So the format may be different, but by making sure that you do not bother your learning objectives or change them, that means that your format can vary, but you're still going to be able to achieve the same objectives, learning objectives. Instructors regularly adapt material to meet departmental needs and to improve curriculum. Is it ethical to alter material to reflect your personal opinions when those opinions run counter to the traditional way of thinking? That's an important thing for you to take away from this particular chapter, and spend some time and sit down and think about this. There's a fuzzy line between, quote, the right thing, end quote, and, quote, my way is the only way, end quote. So there's a definitely fuzzy line between the right thing and my way is the right way. What might seem like a simple adaptation could have serious consequences for a student who is not trained thoroughly and properly to department standards. Accommodating instructor style. Lesson plans may be adapted to accommodate your personal style. A lesson plan often reflects the style of the instructor who wrote it. Consider whether the lesson plan fits your style, for instance, as far as humor is concerned. Meeting the needs of students. All adaptations should be made for one purpose: to meet the needs of the students. Your main goal is to provide instruction that allows students to obtain knowledge or skills. Your goal should be verified after you review and adapt a lesson plan. Review the lesson plan. Make adaptations that you need, as long as they don't bother your content. And then when you're done with this process, make sure that you're still meeting the ultimate goal. Now let's summarize the points we discussed in this chapter. First, we talked about how an instructor who uses a well-prepared and thorough lesson plan to organize and prepare for the class greatly increases the odds of ensuring quality student learning. All instructional planning begins by identifying the desired outcomes, objectives. We talked about ABCD method. In the ABCD method of writing learning objectives, ABCD stands for A, which is audience, B, which is behavior, which is what. C is condition, so how are you doing something, or what are you using to meet a specific condition. And then D is the degree, how well are you achieving each of the steps of your lesson plan. Now, lesson plans include a lot, so let's review what we talked about. Lesson plans include the following parts: your lesson title or lesson topic, level of instruction, behavioral objectives, performance objectives, and learning outcomes, instructional materials needed, the lesson outline, references and resources, and a lesson summary and assignments. While reviewing and preparing for class with a lesson plan, the four-step method of instruction is the primary process used to relate the material contained in the lesson plan to the students. And that four-step method of instruction is preparation, presentation, application, and evaluation. We also talked about preparation. Preparation for instruction is very important. You may need to spend several hours preparing to teach a class, including reviewing the lesson plan, reserving classrooms and instructional aids, and purchasing materials. An Instructor 1 can use a lesson plan to teach a class and may adapt the lesson plan to the local needs of the class. And we talked about this important point. The method of instruction is the one area that an Instructor 1 may readily alter. So your method may be altered, but your content may not. The main focus when adapting a lesson plan is to make minor adjustments so it fits your local conditions and your students' needs. To accomplish this goal, you must be familiar with your audience. Continuing with our summary, this next point is important. You should review and adapt the lesson plan based on the facilities that will be used when delivering the class. And a lesson plan must be reviewed to ensure that it meets and follows local SOPs. After completely reviewing the lesson plan, research the SOPs and ensure that no conflicts exist. To conclude our summary of what we covered in this chapter, these last 3 points are as follows. The lesson plan should be reviewed based on students' limitations and adapted to accommodate those limitations if possible. Reviewing and adapting a lesson plan should be a formal process. You should document in writing which adaptations have been made. And finally, all adaptations should be done with one purpose in mind, namely, meeting the new needs of the student. Class, thank you so much for your time and attention. If you have any concerns or questions about anything covered here in Chapter 5, please do feel free to contact your instructor. Again, as always, thank you for your time. We will meet again for Chapter 6.